Hello and welcome to the Park County Community Foundation's nonprofit network training. We are very happy to have Andrew Lau with us today to talk about how we can promote resilience even in the wake of secondary trauma. So this is actually part one of what's going to be a two-part training. In this training, Andrew's going to give us an overview of his resiliency techniques that he's been working on. And then 2 weeks from today, on the 29th, we are going to have a additional event, which is going to be from noon to 2 at the Shane Center. And that is going to be both a sharing out of information about what different organizations are doing in response to the flood. And then we're going to be structuring that as a practice group to implement some of these resiliency techniques that we're going to learn about today. Andrew comes to us from Missoula, and I'm so glad we can have him in Livingston, even though we are meeting remotely. He is a psychotherapist in private practice. He has also done a lot with supervision and has really spent some significant time figuring out how to create sustainability for those of us who work in human services and are likely to encounter secondary trauma. The other folks that I'm very happy to have on this call is Amy Tickmeyer-Stevens and Kelly Miller. They have both had extensive training with Andrew in these strategies, and they are going to be helping co-facilitate that follow-up session that I mentioned on the 29th. So thank you all for joining us. I am going to hand things over to Andrew.
Thank you, Barb. It's really exciting to be here in Livingston doing a live Zoom with people that are local, but we don't get to see each other. It's like another one of those COVID inventor things. We really try to create an interactive platform as we're doing this work. So if you're able to have your camera on, it will help us to make some of that connectivity happen in the learning. And then we really welcome both verbal or chat responses, preferably verbal. So just mind your mute button on and off as you engage and disengage in verbal responses. So welcoming you guys to this training, and I'm really excited to be co-facilitating with Amy and Kelly today. One of the key principles of building resiliency inside of organizations and in our communities is collaboration. And so I feel like anytime we're going after identifying the secondary trauma that comes to our workforce from the traumatic experiences that we engage, the more we can have co-facilitation and collaborative support, the more effective our overall efforts are going to be, because we know that trauma always has as a secondary symptom isolation. So collaboration is a really big key. And I first discovered that about 6 years ago when we first developed the principles that this training is based on. I was basically working as a therapist in Missoula, and the director of our CAN network there at First Step, they're the team that does work with children and women that have been the subject of sexual assault or survivors of sexual assault. They contacted me after having gone to a national training where the national training said that they needed to do something to protect their workers. But when they got back, the director called me and she said, they told us we needed to do something to protect our workers, but they didn't tell us what to do. And so I was like, well, why did you call me? And she said, well, because I always call you when I don't know what to do. And we had a whole history of working together in the community. And so we got her team of nurses and therapists together. I brought my skill in terms of trauma work, attachment theory, embodiment theory, and she brought her dynamic leadership. And we created an intervention, a 90-minute a month intervention for her team that was incredibly successful for them. At the end of that first year of work, we did an evaluation with them, and the nurses basically said some form of the same thing, which is after the work that they had done with these principles and staying engaged in their work at First Step, that this was the first time in their work careers they felt met, they felt known, they felt understood, and they even felt like they were growing from the intense trauma exposure that they had in their work setting. And I thought this was incredibly ironic that people that were so exposed to trauma in their work setting were actually experiencing power and strength through the work. And so we began to spread the work from that first experience. The year after, we started working with Missoula County Attorney's Office, and then we won a National County Associations Award. And so our curriculum has been moving across the nation, county by county. And in the process of that, I got to meet Kelly and Amy in a training that we do out in Boulder every month called our Deeper Dive, where we train people in these principles in a deeper way and begin to equip them to demonstrate leadership in their communities. So I was hoping that Amy and Kelly could just give us a quick introduction to their exposure to these practices and how you have been utilizing them in your own life and work here in Livingston.
I can go first. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a social worker here at the Livingston Food Resource Center, and I'm a somewhat new social worker. So I just have been at the Food Resource Center 2 years, and I graduated like 2 years ago plus. And I noticed this last, COVID, I entered when COVID was happening. And I was fortunate enough to be able to see my clients one-on-one. I mean, that's how it felt for me. And but I noticed the end of last year, 2021, that I was definitely experiencing a lot of secondary trauma from the people that I see at the Food Resource Center for therapy and for case management. And so I knew about Andy just because of school, because he's related to the University of Montana through a lot of other things, and he had come and spoken to our classroom. And so I looked into the training. I remember him talking about this, and then decided to go. And it was great because Kelly and I ended up being there at the same time. But I think it was what I've learned from it since. And I'm a yoga practitioner, and I'm just throwing that out there because those of you that know that I own my own studio for many years, but I thought I knew this, but I didn't in this job, or I couldn't do it as in this job, which was when I'm dysregulated, I can then I have a problem regulating my own clients. And that seems simple and easy, but it was not. I was having a hard time doing that. And so just what I learned at the training in Boulder was like, okay, get back to regulating yourself. And then how do you then help your clients regulate themselves? So again, seems super simple, but for me, I just had to get back into it. And sometimes it's an hourly practice with each client, but sometimes it goes smoothly. And right at this moment, I don't have that same burnout factor, which is so awesome. So that's my story.
Thank you so much, Amy. Kelly, how about you? Just an introduction to your exposure to these ideas and practices.
Yeah, sure. So pretty much everything that Amy just said, she was pretty spot on. My name is Kelly Miller. I wear a couple hats in the community. I'm the weekend advocate for Aspen. I answer the support line that we have 24/7. I own the Movement Collaborative. And then I'm the senior program manager for the Phoenix. So we offer free programming to people that are in recovery. I have been a trauma and resiliency nut for several years prior to meeting Andrew. And prior to that, I've always worked in crisis work. So I was either working in law enforcement, military, anything that involved crisis I lived for. And it's a lot easier to react to emergencies, and go in and swoop in and save the day than doing this ground level work that what we are doing. I'm not saying being law enforcement is easy, being military is easier. However, it's very easy to kind of put out the fire in an immediate process rather than working one-on-one with that individual, that client who experienced that and that aftermath. We have those people in place to kind of put out those fires immediately, but I feel like all of us, we deal with the aftermath. So after the fire truck leaves, after, the police officers leave. And that is a lot more intentional. And I feel like I didn't experience a whole lot of secondary trauma. Well, what I didn't think, when I did some of that, I haven't experienced it more. I've experienced it more working one-on-one with clients than I was doing military stuff, working in law enforcement, because it was almost like a one and done here, where we see the same clients in our community over and over and again, and we help them, right? And then, oh, bam, they have another setback that we have to help them with. And that's a lot on our nervous system. That's a lot on our mental, emotional health, right? And so when I heard of, I actually attended Andrew's training when he was first here at the City County Complex quite a few years ago. And I just loved it. I knew you can get someone to kind of match your energy, but I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know how to call it, and I didn't know the scientific word term until we started kind of diving deeper into Andrew's training with co-regulation and mirror neurons, and how you can kind of set the tone realistically with kind of your own vitality that you kind of project through your words, your facial expressions, how you sit, how you, and then in that, right, being able to be really mindful of what that looks like externally to others. And that I think has helped me the most, especially working. I teach yoga at the Gallatin County Detention Center once a week. I teach all the men, and then I teach all the women that are willing anyway. And that has helped me when I went through Andrew's training. I feel like I probably would have dipped out by now if I didn't have Andrew's training in my own, like noticing what's going on with me when an inmate says something about a specific pose, or when an inmate comes in with a specific not attitude, but in a specific mood, in a specific emotional state. It's really helped me work with people that are experiencing addiction or are experiencing being new to recovery, for sure.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's just so helpful to hear the different ways that trauma impacts us, both first responders, ongoing work that engages us in deep relationships with the people we serve. Because, secondary trauma emerges throughout our workforce in all of these different ways. I like to say that secondary trauma spreads like a wildfire. And what I mean by this metaphor is that when you engage the needs of your community, whether they're macro level needs or direct service needs, and the community is reverberating with traumatic impact. I mean, I was just down in Red Lodge, and they're still dealing with the impact of that flooding event this last summer, as you guys are, and we'll be working with later. But there's all other kinds of secondary trauma and trauma that are operating in the cultures that we work in. What we now know is that when workers engage this trauma directly, that the impact of the trauma that's in the systems they're working in or the lives they're working with actually jump the brain barrier and rewire workers' own nervous systems with the secondary trauma, the trauma that they engage directly in the work system. We're going to learn a little bit about how that works neurologically in this training, but a narrative that kind of describes how it operates emerged from in my life in about the first 3 years of my social work career, actually the first 3 weeks of my social work career. I was trained at the University of Chicago back in the late 80s. And my first job was to work on the south side of Chicago in a really compromised neighborhood with a lot of gun violence and poverty and lack of education and resources. And my job was to work with 6 African-American young women who were all homeless and pregnant. And I was a really motivated social worker who had to wear a tie at the time. And I was driving my brand new little Corolla that I'd got as a graduation present, down into the hood to make connection across, socioeconomic differences, gender differences, racial differences, as I was learning about these young women's lives. And I think it was the 3rd week of that experience. I was coming home on a Friday night. And my partner, who's a really awesome hearth tender, was making dinner. And something that night was slightly off about the dente quality of the pasta. And what emerged in my kitchen in that moment was evidence of this wildfire, but we were not equipped with the neuro understandings or the trauma-based understandings. I was not trained in this at the University of Chicago to know what was actually happening. But the first thing that happened is I started to protest the quality of the pasta with vocabulary words that I had not heard or known 3 weeks before, because this was the language system of my clients. Then I was moving my body with a kind of intensity that was not like a white guy with a tie. I was already beginning to move my body like these young African-American women were moving their bodies as they're protesting, the absence of resources, the vulnerability they felt being pregnant and homeless. And then the third thing that happened, or I noticed, is there was such intensity coming out of me as I was basically like discharging this material that had gotten stored in my nervous system unconsciously from that work I'd been doing with these clients. And then I was bringing that wildfire of trauma spread like right into the core of my home setting. And so this is what we mean by the metaphor of the wildfire. Like when we engage trauma and don't know how to track it, it actually creates traumatic impact in our own nervous system. And then we can spread that in our organizations and into our family cultures. And so we want to work with dealing with the impact of these sets of traumas that we deal with all the time to try to understand more about how our nervous systems operate and how we can be more effective so that we don't end up harming ourselves or the people that we love the most as we do the good work of human service work or social service work. So I'm really excited for you guys to be a part of the training process today. Like, we don't want to wait till workers are overwhelmed and look like this. We want to try to find ways of meeting workers on the front end as they enter their careers, so we can help give them resources and strategies so that they can actually thrive with skills and learn skills that can help protect them from this wildfire of secondary trauma intrusion. So we're going to learn a little bit about these 4 theories. There's a lot of cognitive learning that happens in this brief training that we're going to be doing this morning. But more important than that, more important than even this cognitive learning, is taking the risk to do some experiential learning today across the Zoom platform. Because one of the things we've noticed, like the kinds of changes that Kelly and Amy just described, or the changes that I've seen move across our state as people have been implementing these strategies, happen by taking the risk to practice and experience the actual process of learning itself. So in the spirit of that, I wanted to begin by starting with an arrival activity that we do in most all of the educational efforts we do, group meetings that we do, whether it's the Missoula Fire Department or Missoula County Attorney's Office. We do this 4-stepped arrival activity that kind of has the core principles of our training material baked into the experience itself. I did also want to say, as we're inviting you into this experiential learning, that experiential learning is all by invitation, like there's no demand. Part of the reason that that's important is because anytime we're working with the idea of trauma or secondary trauma, all of us can have our own differential responses to that. And so we want you to be responsible for your nervous system, and we don't want to push you with this training beyond any area or a level that you're ready to engage. But with that spirit, I'm just going to invite you into this arrival activity. So the first step in arrival is to bring your awareness out of the Zoom and into the room that you're in. And just notice that shift, how you can bring awareness from the screen into the room that you're in. And then I'd encourage you to bring awareness to track the weight of your body in the chair or your feet at the floor. And just notice if you're kind of up off the chair or the floor as we're getting started today, or if you're kind of collapsing down into the chair or the floor, or if you have that sense of being met by the chair or the floor. Again, we're not fixing anything. We're just tracking where we are as we begin this learning process. So the second step is I just invite you to orient yourself in the room that you're in. And the best way to do that is to use the portals of the 5 senses to get data about this space that we're in through isolating the senses one by one. So first, just take the visual sense. Just notice the quality of light in the room you're in, or colors, or shapes, or shadows. And then activating that sense of sound. So noticing like sounds in the distance, and then sounds closer in. Then when we move to skin or touch, just noticing things like temperature in the room or humidity. So notice that you're free to move and look behind you. If a mammal was orienting in the wild in a new space, they'd look behind them to scan for danger. And we know that those stretches can actually create regulation in the back body. So just noticing that moving is another part of that skin sense. And then the last 2 senses are the sense of smell and taste together. So just notice as you breathe in or taste any kind of information that comes in to your system about this space that you're in. So the third step in arrival is to come back into the connecting of the Zoom platform itself. Now, if we were in a circle or a training room, we'd be able to use eye contact and connection and welcome. But try to replicate that even through this Zoom platform. So just take a moment to look a little more deeply into each of the Zoom screens with that intention to make contact with each other. When I do this kind of step with the Missoula County Attorney's Office, they call this Andy's predatory eye contact because they don't like the connection so much. But it's like, we're not trying to do predating. We're just trying to connect. It's just to add that little extra bit of dynamic connection as we start this training process.
And I just want to share that Terry Hartley, who is joining us, she is on a computer that unfortunately doesn't have a camera or a microphone, but I think many of you know Terry, so we can picture her smiling face with us today.
Thank you, Barb. And then the fourth step in arrival is take a second and just track you this morning as we're getting started. It might be your mood or your energy level, or it might be kind of like already your sense of connection or disconnection with this training process. But think of the one word that describes something about you this morning as we're getting started. Like just one word. And we're going to kind of check in with each other to get a sense of this learning group just through this one word check-in. So I'll start. I'm feeling really chill this morning, just chill as we're getting started. But I'm curious, what's your word? Take a risk to tell us. What's your word as we get started? The chat or vocally?
My word is heavy. Very heavy.
Heavy. So notice that, heavy. Welcome. Who else? What's your word?
I think my word today is toggle. Just
Say again.
Toggle. I'm just feeling all the things, like all the habits.
Toggle. You guys get that? And notice what's happening if you're tracking the screen. As people are checking in with the word, I'm repeating the word and I'm trying to get the same level of tone and intensity. And then when Lori did that, I was moving with her. That's an intentional strategy. That's an attachment strategy of mirroring and resonance that signals welcome to mammals. So toggling with Lori, welcome. Who else? What's your word?
Andrew, in the chat line, we have peaceful, from Stella.
Yep.
Angelina, fatigue.
Fatigue. Fatigue. We need to make that space for the mirroring. So the fatigue. And then what's the other words, Barb, in the chat?
And then Amy Coolidge, calm.
Calm.
Yeah.
Other folks, anyone else in the Zoom can audibly share the word that describes them as we're getting started.
For me, this morning has been very busy.
Busy. That's the word. Busy. Got you. Anyone else?
I'm going to go with overwhelm.
Overwhelm. And you guys notice, if you focus on the mirroring and the resonance for a moment, what happens is you actually take that word into your own system and you feel it with the participants. That's what mammals need to create connection. But then we also want to be able to come back to that first position, back to our anchor, our body in the chair, because we don't want to get so overly stimulated with all the information that's coming in from other people's nervous system. So, and that's really the dilemma of secondary trauma. Like, trauma needs engagement to create healing, but then workers have not yet developed the skill to engage and then to disengage. And so that's really our practice as we're doing this arrival. Anyone else? What's your word as we're getting started?
Andrew, Terry Hartley is fragmented.
Fragmented. Just kind of hold that in your awareness. And
I
then
feel
just
encouraged.
encouraged. Got you. Welcome. Anyone else? What's your
I
word?
feel intense.
Intense. Gotcha. And can you guys notice that dynamism of the mirroring and resonance that is designed to create this dynamic group environment? And so one of the ways we use this 4-step arrival in a group or team meeting that could have various content is we replace what we would call the narrative check-in. And like, you guys know how that rolls, right? You go to a meeting that's scheduled for an hour, you spend 25 minutes like checking in and telling about everybody's job and role, and then their third cousin's birthday and their Costco cakes. And there's all this narrative, right? And like, it's valuable, but it's also not that efficient. And so the arrival activity that we just modeled, it has a body-centered regulation. We regulate in the space that we're in. We then make conscious connection. And then the one word creates that experience of resonance. And typically, we can get through that in 7 to 10 minutes. And our theory is that after that, things go much better in teams. So thank you guys for being a part of that arrival process as like we move into this shared learning environment together. So we're going to learn a little bit about the brain, the neuroscience. We're going to learn about the body and why current understandings of the brain imply our bodies. A lot of times people who just hear about our work will have some pushback or resistance. They're like, this sounds like woo-woo or yoga or weirdness. And we like to always remind people that it's neuroscience that has taken us to the body. And anytime we ask people or teach a skill that involves the body, we want to legitimate it through the most current science that's coming through our neurosystems. But one of the most important things to deal with in terms of secondary trauma and trauma awareness is the impact of affect or emotion for mammals. Because one of the things that we really believe is that we're susceptible to secondary trauma as workers, not so much because we're human, it's because we're mammals. And it's based on the research of a fellow named Jan Panskip, who was a affective neuroscientist from the Netherlands. And he basically did research that demonstrated that all mammals share 7 affective states. So like, for example, when you look at this cat, we can understand at the emotional level in terms of mirroring what we can imagine that cat is experiencing, right? So there's a sort of charge, or that sense of rage or intensity or protection. That also is a mammalian affective response. And so one of the things that we've done to kind of create a core of understanding at the heart of our work is we've taken these 7 affective states from his research and we boiled them down into 3 affective systems that we share with all mammals. It's the red threat system, the green drive system, and then the blue nurturance system. And we're going to spend some time just kind of describing how these three systems work, because they really define how secondary trauma and the wildfire works in our own system. So this red system, the threat system, this was one of the earliest systems that developed in mammalian consciousness, because mammals don't have good external protection from danger. Like, I don't have a shell or poison quills to kind of keep me safe. So hardwired, like deep into the emotional center of my brain, is this red system, this threat system, whose purpose is protection. And it basically has two functions. The first function is when I'm in danger, it has this kind of activating quality. If you look at the top of that image, it kind of like activates that threat response. Sometimes people call it fight or flight. I like to think about examples from COVID to demonstrate this, because, you know, COVID represented in the beginning of it, and even as we've moved through all these phases of it, a kind of shared cultural trauma response. So a lot of what we experience there will help us understand how these systems work. For me, with the threat system, I always think about the first time I went back to Target in 2020 after the shutdown. I hadn't seen people in a long time, and I needed deodorant. So I went to the Target parking lot in Missoula, where I'd been 1,000 times. And that time I was getting out and putting my mask on for the first time in public and trying to figure out what 6 feet of distance was. And I remember, like, the whole parking lot felt like it was on fire. It was just like all this intensity. And then I got into the constriction of the store and the aisles with people in close proximity, and the threat increased. You know, there was that high level of tension. So then I get my deodorant and I'm up at the checkout, and the guy is like scanning and sanitizing between each item. And so I catch his eye and I say to him, "Hey, this looks like it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better." And then he sanitized again. And then he says to me, "You know, I'm afraid for myself, but if I was your age, I'd be terrified." And I remember at that point, my threat system went through the roof, and I like grabbed my deodorant and I was like out the door. So that's that high activation of the threat system. But the second function of the threat system is that collapsing function, or that disassociating function. I like to look at that in the image. Do you see that kind of shadow in the image right underneath the siren or the alarm? That's that part of our system that when we're in high levels of danger that go on, that we have this kind of checked out quality, or this disassociative quality. An example from the pandemic, I remember, like, about the 4th month, there was an article in the New York Times that said this was the worst economic collapse in a decade. And then the online version actually said 2 days later that it was the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. And I just remember, like, at that point having like no emotional response, just this kind of flatness, because even though I care about my 401k and all this stuff, there was like no ability for my system to process any more threat. And so it's that disassociative process that I think many people are continually caught in when we deal with the chronicity of the trauma that we experience. So the second system is this green system, or the drive system. Drive is that go energy that's at the core of human experience. I always think about kids, like play is drive. Like, you don't really have to teach a kid to play. They just play. Or if I take my dog to the river, we don't have to have a console in the passenger seat so that he knows to jump out and chase things. Like, that's just what he does. It's like drive. And so for many of us, especially those of us who work in kind of mission-driven work, where we're focused on the delivery of welfare service to other, work is a big part of our drive. And think about all the ways we had to change the ways that we worked as we moved through this COVID pandemic. One of the things that's really clear is a lot of organizations have so much red that they deal with in their organizations, and there's such a focus on drive that work culture becomes like red, green, red, green, red, green, red, green, like all of the time. There's this relentlessness to the red, green, red, green, red, green that really instills the secondary trauma like deep into workers' experience. But the third of these systems is the blue system or the nurturance system. And this system was designed so that the other two systems can work better. So the way that it evolved is a red threat needs to be responded to with blue or nurturance, and then the green system works better, right? So it's like red, blue, green, like red, blue, green. And these are some of the things in this image of this girl and her dog that demonstrate how blue works. So take a second and look at this image. Where do you see evidence of the blue in this image? Love to hear from several of you. Where's the blue in this image?
Her hand on the dog's head.
Okay, so the touch, right? The touch. What's the quality of that touch, would you guys say?
It looks affectionate.
Affectionate? Any other words come to mind? I want you to focus on detail tracking. What other things do you guys see in that touch? Affectionate, what else?
Intentional.
Intentional?
It looks
Other words?
playful. It looks playful
Playful?
to me. And also I'm just noticing like both of the dog and the girl's facial expressions. They look, you know, content with each other, with being with each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. What a lot of people say when they see that is they say they're both smiling. And then that makes me smile, right? And that it actually proves the point that Panskip was making, that mammals connect through affect, because they're clearly connected emotionally, these two that we see in their expressions. Any other evidence of blue that you guys see? So we have the facial connection, the emotion, the touch, anything else?
Do you see, I see a little bit of hesitance because her heel is on the dog, not the whole hand, like she's kind of just lifting a little bit.
Like, Amy, would you call that like kind of like tentative?
Yes, tentative,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank
So you guys, the reason why we're breaking down the details of that touch is, and we're going to learn this, we learn a little bit more about the brain, is that all of those little micro details are the ways that secondary trauma gets embedded in our system. It doesn't come in like, oh, I made contact with someone's trauma, like a concept. It comes in as we interact with people. The details are what we need to learn to track, to be able to track how it's entering our system. So it's really helpful that you guys are learning this skill around the blue itself. It's interesting what Amy just said, because I actually utilized your guys' police department as an example of this. When I did the training that Kelly was talking about, we were working with this, and there was a number of police officers there. And one of the captains was looking at it and he said, that's not really tentative touch or playful. He goes, that's right before she grabs him. And I thought to myself, dude, that's more about your nervous system than this picture. You know, it's kind of what I was thinking. Other evidence of blue, look at the proximity, like how there's a certain closeness and distance. That also helps to create the blue. And then one thing that we often miss is the body mirroring that's happening here. So notice how their heads kind of turn toward each other, and then the lower bodies both kind of fall away in the image. One of the ways that we actually connect with people, a lot of the blue connecting happens non-cognitively as our bodies connect and disconnect with the people that we're connected with. And so blue operates in this deep, like full-brained way. And so one of the things we know is that all of these systems, the red, green, and blue, have all been impacted by the trauma of the COVID pandemic. Because if you look at this image and you think about how blue is communicated or transacted, think about what we've been through with COVID. When touch suddenly became toxic or dangerous, and then we couldn't read affect well, because of masking and separation. And then for many of us, we haven't actually even been in the same room with the people that we work with for many, many months during the pandemic. So this body mirroring and the connecting that the blue helps to create was also absent during the bulk of the pandemic. So you could say that red, green, and blue, like none of them were functioning in ways that we're familiar with as we moved through this great traumatization that came with the pandemic. So I wanted to say a couple things about the brain and the brain science. You know, a lot of times when we talk about the brain, we just kind of check out because it sounds like science. So I just want to give you just a little bit of understanding about the brain that will help you understand why we use the brain so dynamically in tracking secondary trauma. So the brain is the only organ in the body that when we're born, it's only partially present, and then it's not fully finished growing until about age 26 structurally. So there's no other organ like that. Like you're not born with like a third of your kneecap and sometime later get more knee, or you don't have like a nose bud and then get more nose later. But the brain is growing really dynamically throughout life, especially the first 5 years of life. And it grows at such a rapid rate that I would almost I like to think about like a time lapse video of a flower growing. You know how you plant it and then there's like stalk, leaf, bud, bloom in like 20 seconds. That's the dynamic rate of the growth of the brain, especially in the first 5 years of life. This is why early intervention is so key for kids, because the brain is not just contained in the head, right? The brain is woven throughout the entire body, like the nervous system and the circulatory system. And all of the things that happen to that being that the brain is in impacts the way the brain grows. So if a kid is held and secure and taught to regulate distress, then their brain is going to grow into a much wholer or more resilient hardware system. But if there's a lot of tension or threat, that's going to get woven into the structure of the brain itself. The other thing we know about the brain is that the brain has what we call a tripartite structure, right? We used to think that the brain would connect just from the thinking brain to the thinking brain. But we now know that the brain grows in utero from the bottom up, and that the earliest parts of the brain to grow in are the embodied parts of the brain. And then the midbrain is where all that emotional and connecting material is. And it's the last part of the brain to grow in, which is that thinking brain, which we have traditionally been taught to think of as brain. It's that abstract thinking. But the brain is really all of that. And most important is the rate of exchange of the brain at different levels. So if I'm going to use my thinking brain, my neocortex, I can make like 10 thoughts a second. But at that earlier, more primitive brain, where all of that embodied material is, that operates at 1/100th of a second, which is, it's an amazing exchange. That's why so much of what gets transacted into our systems isn't cognitive. Think about my example of the young women I worked with in the first 3 weeks of my career. It's like they impacted me in the embodied brain, and that's what was in me that then got discharged into my home setting. It wasn't like the content of their story. It was the way they were conveying their experience as traumatized humans into my embodied brain that created that wildfire spread. So part of what we want to do is to begin to understand more and more how workers who keep trying to come to the work setting, like presenting this kind of professional face to the world, we want to be able to begin to access and impact all of this material that's running deeper in their brain structure, deeper in their nervous system, because this is the place where the secondary trauma actually gets embedded into our systems. So take a look at this image of this heart, and you see kind of the strange lines to the left. And think about some of the things I've described, the learning we've been doing about the brain and then the red, green, and the blue, the threat, drive, and the nurturance. And then think about the ways you have moved through or been impacted by the COVID pandemic. What do you see in that image that's kind of a picture of how you have been impacted by this shared trauma of the pandemic? What do you notice there about your story in this image? I'd love to hear from like several of you. What do you see here?
I see energy leaving my heart.
So the energy is like to the left and the heart is following.
In my perspective right now, the heart is relatively stationary, and there is an outflow of energy from the heart to the left.
Right. And what is that outflow? Is it Keva?
Yes, Keva. Mhm.
Keva, what is that outflow? Like, is it the energy you're giving to others, or like, how would you describe how it operates?
I would say it's a combination of the energy that I give to others. It's also, okay, I worked in the environmental business, and we did a lot of negative air work with asbestos and lead-based paint. So you've got a negative air pressure that's happening.
Yes.
To extract things. That's what that's reminding me of, like all of the stuff, the trauma that's going on outside me is like sucking the life out of my heart, kind of.
Oh, I get it. I get it.
Energy.
It's like, so it's not so much like you're radiating good energy. It's a little bit like your energy is being sucked out of your system as you engage the trauma around you.
Right. I just hope that the poor people on the receiving end of that drainage there are getting a little of the good stuff that's in my heart. So
You're
that's
hoping
my
that
hope.
they're getting some of the love. It's interesting. Your description matches one of my, I've worked with this image for hundreds of trainings, and one of my favorite came from the Office of Public Defender in Lake County. And they were training young attorneys to do court for the first time in March of 2020, which is a stressful thing for them. But suddenly they're training them online, like from their kitchens on Zoom platforms, to do court for this, for the same, for the first time. And one of their mid-level managers who was on the training is a really powerful native leader and a woman named Eldina Bear Don't Walk. And so in the training, Eldina said in front of her colleagues, she goes, "Oh, Andy, that picture reminds me of my breast." And I was like, "Eldina, you're talking about your breast in my training?" And she goes, "Yep." She goes, "It's my breast." And she said, when I first started working with those young attorneys online, it's like I grew 5 udders and they were sucking me dry. So it's that same sense of depletion that has come as like we've been engaging others and we're pulled like into emptiness. That is the similarity there. But other folk, what do you see in the image? I'm so curious. What do you notice?
I had that sort of opposite direction flow feeling about it. So I saw it as inputs, and I thought about it through the lens of whether or not I felt safe or whether those were welcomed inputs, and see the solid lines as welcomed and varying variation or durations, I guess, right? So that, some you could use more of and some feel more substantial, but then saw those dashed lines as more of the what I would say threat, or where it just felt less welcomed, and just didn't feel like a full flow. I don't know how to put that, but
no, I'm hearing you, Laura. It's almost like as you remain open, like stuff keeps coming in that you have to handle or manage or respond. And like some of it's welcome, but the jagged lines are representing things that have higher levels of suffering or toxicity or tension.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's also interesting too, sometimes like really in the middle of COVID, people were talking about how there were so many more things that they were having to manage. It wasn't just like the work stuff. It was like elders that might be ill, or like tensions. Like, so it's like this all we have to hold is part of what you see in the image.
Yeah. And I definitely have sort of like a couple of segments of time and radically different experiences of it. And so I can sort of separate those as well a little bit.
Got it. Excellent. Other folk, what do you see? One of the reasons I love this image so much in the training is because as we move through COVID, often we were so isolated that we weren't actually talking to each other about how we move through it. So what do other folks see here?
Something that I noticed about the image is that none of the lines are touching. There's these spaces between all of the lines, and that was something that I think was true during COVID, was just the lack of touch and contact and connection outside of the home.
Yep, that deep ice, like maybe we have these bubbles of connection, but the generalized response is disconnect from the people and the places that we've been formerly much more connected to as part of the experience of that isolation. Definitely. Other folk, what do you see?
I kind of saw those lines as like a hindrance to the whole, right? So just like this and this annoying thing that was sort of getting in the way of the full heart, something you kind of want to like shove out of there, because it's interfering with the whole heart, I guess. It's kind of how I was looking at that.
And like, Jesse, did you experience that during the pandemic? Like it messed with your ability to be whole? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that. Yep, definitely. I'm sort of an extroverted social individual, and I don't think that my life was nearly as disrupted as some, others or people who lived in larger cities. I think, living in Montana, we had a lot of opportunity to do outside social things. But it definitely limited the ability to do the things that we can now sort of get back to, like, outside music and indoor movie theaters, or things that I feel comfortable now participating in, which gives me energy.
So like you're saying, like currently in this phase, there's been like a reduction in that way it's messing with wholeness, and like, so like the lines are diminishing and there's more of a return to that whole.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, yes. In the optimistic view, yes.
I remember like I love live music, and I hadn't been to the Kettle House in Missoula for like 3 years. And so I went to a show this summer and I was in the mosh pit and I was so ecstatic, and I just turned around, instead of looking at the band, I just faced the crowd, and it was like, I've been waiting for you, that sense of that extroverted connection that can be so dynamic that we'd lost that in this period.
Yeah.
So you guys, as you see, there's multiplicity of ways to describe this image, but the point of it is that when we're experiencing traumatic impact, we have to find effective ways to connect around it that allow us to be able to actually experience with others that dynamic sense of what they're experiencing. Like, we're not trying to fix Jesse's dilemma or solve other people's dilemmas. We're just trying to engage, mirror, and support. And that mirroring and support is what allows for part of the miracle of post-traumatic growth to occur. And I wanted to describe post-traumatic growth because this isn't something that I was aware of when I first started doing the work with First Step 5 or 6 years ago. I thought that my job when I started to work with that first team was just to reduce toxicity. I knew that the workers who were giving their whole self to the task of supporting women and children who've been subject to sexual violence and assault these women were experiencing high levels of distress. And I thought my job was to somehow get that out of their system. And even though there was a detoxification that was happening, that was only a sliver of what actually occurred. Because what we started to notice right away is that as we helped them effectively engage the secondary trauma in their own systems, their lives were actually surging and growing. So take a look at this image. Like if you look deep into the core of the picture, those rocks that are at the heart of that tree, they represent what we call PTEs, or potentially traumatizing experiences. And if we don't address those in our work cultures, they will turn into PTSD. I mean, they actually changed the DSM-5, the code for diagnosis in my profession, to include secondary trauma. So you can have the same symptom pattern as a vet or a kid who's been traumatized through doing direct service with traumatic situations. But if we have the ability to kind of surround those PTEs, the way those roots surround those rocks, then the potential is that they don't traumatize us, but they actually become the foundation for growth of the entire tree. Another metaphor I like to use is this metaphor of this artesian well. So it's like, rather than workers or the work culture collapsing into this pond of co-traumatization, if we help people develop the right kind of connecting skills, like we've been practicing today, we talked about the red heart, or when we were doing the one word with the resonance, or the right kind of awareness skills, like tracking our physiology, using our thinking brain to track what's actually happening in our embodied brain and our nervous system, then what happens is we have this surge of power and growth that comes right out of the middle of trauma itself. And so when I realized that, that's when I became a big critic of the whole idea of self-care. And you know how self-care works, right? Like you go to work, you give of your whole self, you start to become depleted from the work in a very understandable way. And then suddenly that's pathologized. It's seen as this problem. And then you're told by a HR person or a coworker that you need to go kind of like practice your self-cares. Like they put it on you to go fix yourself. You know, they might give you like a fruit basket at Christmas or an EAP program to help with the therapy to fix yourself. But the message is that it's all on you. And the problem I have with this paradigm is that trauma is by its very nature isolating. So like, why would you have an idea like self-care to deal with something that's much better remedied through engagement, connection, like creating a more dynamic structure in the core of the work culture itself? The other dilemma I have with this is self-care is reactive. Like we wait till people are already burned out, like that image of that nurse or doctor in the first part of the presentation. What I'm much more interested in is coming to the front end of people's employment or careers and giving them the skills to track how secondary trauma is working in their system so they can actually grow from the work they do and not be depleted by it. So when I began to understand that, that's when we developed this formula that's kind of at the core of how we understand the connection between secondary trauma and resilience. So just let me walk you through the formula. So the red box, that basically indicates that trauma is always with us. Like we are not going to fix trauma in any kind of discrete sense. We're not going to like etch a sketch trauma like out of the human experience. What we're called upon to do with trauma is to engage it. That's why there's a plus sign in the formula. A self-care would be a minus, like get away from the trauma and go heal yourself. Our formula is about engaging the action and the intensity of the heat of the traumatic experiences themselves, but then engaging them with these two skill sets. The blue box is the awareness skills, that using the thinking brain to track what's happening in the physiology. And the gold box, that's the connecting skills, learning how to use this connecting that we've already been practicing in this training. And we know that if we bring these two skills into the work culture as we encourage our workers to engage the trauma, the end result is always growth. It just happens every time. It's like a principle that we can count on or trust. So what we've done in terms of our curriculum, STAR-T, secondary trauma activates resilience. You can hear in the naming this formula, right? It's not like secondary trauma healed by self-care. It's secondary trauma activates, that's the plus sign, growth. We've developed skills into what we call a toolbox of resilience. And we have about 20 skills in the toolbox. Half of them are the blue box skills, the awareness skills, and half of them are connecting skills, because different workers respond to different resources. When we work in teams, in group culture, like with resiliency skills practices groups and things like this inside of our organizations, we blend the awareness skills and the connecting skills together so that people can actually grow together as teams. And so what I'm going to invite you guys to do just in the next 25 minutes as we work with the last part of this training is we're just going to learn and practice like 3 of the daily skills that come from the blue box or the awareness skills. And the reason that we're doing those skills today is because it's easier to kind of convey those through a Zoom platform. I mean, you guys did a really great job with the connecting, like with the red heart and the one word, and we'll still be doing connecting. But a lot of that is much better conveyed in like live environments. So I'm just going to invite you to experientially learn with us as we learn this suite of awareness skills that you could take right into your work settings this afternoon and begin to develop the strength that comes from in the engagement of the trauma in our culture. So this first skill is what we call the morning grounding activity. And this is an opportunity in the very beginning of the day to identify a place that is inside your own system or physiology that can serve as an anchor point or a regulatory place that is a calm and strong spot that's in the core of your system. Now, from the lens of trauma theory, this is important because we know that if we just keep engaging the red threat of trauma with more engagement and we don't focus on regulation, that we're going to spread the red. That's why a lot of debriefing work is ineffective, because if we don't teach people how to regulate and we engage all the trauma around them just through conversation or narrative processing, we actually can create more harm. So this is kind of the first step in beginning to have a resilience-based model. I remember, like, I think it was the August 2020, I was working with some nurses up in Polson. And I don't know if you remember that period of the pandemic, but we were all going back to school for the first time and all the rules kept changing. We didn't know if it was going to be in person or not, or online or what was happening. And it was just like crazy making. And one of the nurses said in the training to me, she said, you know, Andy, what we haven't figured out yet is that there's no horizon line with this pandemic. We don't know where we're headed. And then the rules keep changing. And she said, all I really have the courage to do is to show up each day and try to live skillfully. And I thought, that's what this morning grounding activity is about. So what I'd invite you guys to do is to kind of understand the body tracking skills that are required to actually kind of do this activity. I'm just going to invite you to do this body tracking activity with me. It takes about 5 minutes. I'm going to stand up. Feel free to move your awareness out of the Zoom and into the room that you're in. You could stand or sit, and I'll just walk you through this kind of 5-step tracking strategy. So the first step is just to become aware again of your feet on the floor. And notice if you're kind of up off the floor, or if you're sort of collapsing down into the floor, or if you have that sense of being met by the floor. And then from that position of awareness, it's like the second step in our arrival. Just notice again the qualities of the room you're in. So check in again with light, sound, the temperature of your body moving in the room, sense of smell and taste, just to orient your body in the safety of this space. And then the third step, I just invite you to ask your body to allow you a space inside your body that you could identify as a calm and strong place, like an anchor point. Now, for me, that's always the spot where my feet hit the floor, but it's unique for each person. Like some people, it's where their head hits the sky, or their eye, or third eye, or breath. Some it's the breath here at the nose and nostril, or other people, it can be the breath down deeper into the belly. I worked with some whitewater rafters 2 summers ago, and they talked about their hip being the place where they anchor against the boat as they move into rapids, and that was their anchor point. For some people, the word anchor is too heavy or confining. I worked with a group of runners in Missoula, and they talked about the calm and strong being that like burn in their thigh after a long run. So just notice, just with that awareness of noticing, not so much thinking, but noticing where your body is allowing this anchor. And then the last step, this fourth step, is kind of a micro tracking step. Try to bring awareness to the spot that is your anchor just now. And then track the sensation at the anchor. So is it smooth or pulsing? Is it buoyant or flat? Just noticing the quality of the action or movement, like at that anchor point. Just noticing that. Okay. So those are the 4 steps of the body tracking. So just inviting you guys to come back into the Zoom. Now, anytime in our work, we do an awareness activity like that, we follow it up with connecting. So what I'm curious about is, as you were doing that activity, what did you notice? What'd you notice? Now, I'm not so concerned with what you thought about it. That's your thinking brain. You know, you're probably like, oh, that Andy's never going to be much of a yoga instructor, or, you know, this is weird to do on Zoom. But what did you, the data that we need is, what did you notice as you did that? I'm curious. Love to hear from several of you. What'd you know?
So I'll share a little bit. So my spot was like right in my sternum. And what I was noticing as you were like going through all the body parts, I was like, yeah, my feet feel anchored, but that's not where my anchor is. Or like, no, it's not really my third eye. Like I really was like, I like feel it in the center of my chest. And then trying to describe that, I was like, yeah, what does that feel like? It feels like deep and internal and stabilizing. Like it just felt like that, like that's where I like want to hang, is sort of in that internal spot in my sternum. And then I was doing some breathing. So I was like, oh yeah, maybe it's like, why is it my sternum? Oh, maybe it's because like when I do, I'm into breathing, you know, when I run, I like, it makes me able to run further. So I really pay attention to that breath. So I was trying to think like, maybe it's because that's the bottom of my diaphragm. So I was sort of trying to like feel it and think why that was just so obvious to me, and then why it was like what internally or what intrinsically made that obvious to me.
Got it. So you guys notice with Jesse, it's so interesting. This helps us develop a vocabulary, I would say, of the bottom up, and the bottom up meaning operating from the lower brain up to the top. So she could load into the sternum. It was like obvious that it was this. And then there was this description of like that depth or core. And I don't notice if you notice, like when she named that, you can almost feel that in your own body across the platform. But then she also has this very active thinking brain. So like, she's trying to feel this, but then she's trying to figure it out, right? And that's just a natural tendency that we all have because we're so wired to prefer that thinking part, right? So excellent example. Other folks, what did you notice when we did that? That body tracking.
So I notice I do this a lot in the yoga practice, and we are lucky we have this at CHP. We do a little small guided meditation before most of our meetings. So my spot is definitely my belly, and I can feel heat, can feel it becoming warmer.
And Amy, like when you feel that belly and that heat, is it like a pulsing heat? Notice that I'm focusing on details. Is it a pulsing heat? Is it a radiating heat? Like how does that heat move in the belly area?
I think it comes into my belly, and the more you stay with the breath, the more it grows.
So the breath kind of helps it expand in the belly, is your sense. Got it. Okay. So excellent. You guys, do you see that? We're focusing on the sensational bottom-up description, and that actually creates the power in these body tracking activities. A lot of times when people do this stuff, they'll experience calm, like you were talking about a meditation practice. That's not really our purpose. Like we're just trying to teach people to track the body, but about half the people who do this have some sort of calming impact. Other folk, as soon as they check in to the body, they notice constriction in their systems, right? Like tension. And that's just another response. And then other folk, when we do it, we'll just check out. We just disassociate. We go to shopping list because these are practices that we're not familiar with, and we need to practice them to kind of grow more competency with them. So thank you guys for those descriptions. And I'm just going to describe then how we take this awareness of the anchor and build it into a morning grounding activity. So what we encourage people to do is at the very beginning of your day, like when you're first starting the day, to track this place in your body where you've identified an anchor. And it's hard to describe the process, but it's just pausing and then dropping in so that you're actually experiencing yourself momentarily from that anchored position. So like when I was first working online during COVID, I'd get on my computer working and my phone and coffee and all that. And then I would just step aside and then I would drop into that spot where my feet hit the floor. I'd maintain that for 30 to 40 seconds because I'm kind of ADHD and can't tolerate more than that. But if I would practice it regularly, then I would have this regulatory place inside my own system that I could return to throughout the day. So that's the basic skill. It's just dropping in. That's the morning grounding. But then we've added on skills to it or parts to it that actually give it more value. And like one of the skills is to take it out of the inside and get it out into the natural world, because our disconnection from nature is one of the reasons why we're so susceptible to secondary trauma. And so like what I like to do is just like when I was working online at home, I would just go out to this cottonwood grove behind my house and do the morning grounding there. And when I bring in the elements of the natural world, it actually adds value to the activity. We've also found in our trainings that a lot of us who have had a lot of our own developmental trauma or sexual trauma, our bodies are never going to be secure alone. They're like the scene of the crime. And so engaging the natural world is part of the morning grounding. The light, the bird sound, the tree, the grass really can add regulatory value to this activity. And then the second add-on is that from that anchored position, we check in with what's happening in the rest of our system. Because we're all carrying a lot all of the time. I remember like when I think it was about the 4th or 5th month of COVID, and I was doing the morning grounding out of my house, and I went out to the Cottonwood Grove, and my phone beeped a notification that said 10,000 people are now dead in the United States. And then I just kept moving towards the tree, and I grounded, and then I checked in, and I was scared. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't paused. And so the checking in is based on a kind of dual awareness theory that operates in EMDR, where if you have a calm, strong place in your body and you check in with distress, we don't fix this. Like we didn't fix that 10,000 dead. It's like 1 million people dead now, but there was that sense of like that morning having it regulate, and I just named it. So I was like scared. And then I went back to my anchor, and then I said scared again, just try to get that acknowledged as I move through my morning grounding. And then the third add-on is we know that trauma and secondary trauma can be really effectively discharged through movement. So we teach what we call neuroplasticity movement. And this is like slow movement with awareness. Think about like Tai Chi practices. We're not building strength, we're building neuro integration and flexibility. So like the way this might operate is like, I remember going out to my tree, anchoring, checking in, and there was always way more than one thing I was holding that day. So I would just let my body move to express the things that I was holding in my awareness. So it might be like the heaviness of task or expectation of what was happening, and just let the movement of the body work with the anchor to create this integrated morning grounding activity that really allows the nervous system to become more whole or connected. I just want to say that I have been able to work with people for many years now who do this practice, and there's been high levels of success in people beginning to be more able to manage their own nervous system as they gain the experience of tracking it. And one of the reasons why this is so valuable to do in the morning, it's easier to begin to track the body around positive sensation, regulatory sensation, than it is around distress. So really encourage folks to start with this morning grounding. Now, I know we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to switch our agenda, and we're going to skip this tracking the regulatory process, and I'm going to send Barb 2 links that she'll send you that you can use to watch our video platform that describes this skill and also another skill, so that you guys can review that after the training. And also it would familiarize you with our website. But this is a way to track how our nervous system is working while we're working, and how to gain strength in the middle of it. But what I'd like to end with this morning is the third of our awareness skills, which is transition rituals at the end of the shift. One of the things we know that it's really important to build awareness in our schedules that represent the transitions from work to home or home to work, or also transitions between the activities in our day. So like, look at this kind of red color field in the middle of this painting. That represents the power of transition. And so what we like to do is help people focus on those places where there are natural transitions, and to build rituals there that help them track what's still operating in their nervous system from the day's work and figuring out ways of releasing it. And we like to make these practices ritualized, which means they have metaphor and humor, and there's like often music or movement that can give these activities value and pleasure. And we also like them to be individualized. So we often use the 4 elements of the natural world to help people build transition activities that work for them uniquely. Because some people are more earth oriented. You know, these are the folks who at the end of the day, they want to get out and garden or dig or walk or be connected to land. They also are really predictable. Like, look at the lines in the painting, the agrarian lines. Earth-based people like doing the same thing over and over at the same time. I think about dog walkers, you know, they're always on the same path with the same dog, saying hi to the same 5 people. Like those are the qualities of kind of an earth-based transition rituals. But air-based people are completely different, right? They can let it go at any time, release it, breathe it out, laugh it out, take it out. Like I got to work with the team at the Poverello Center in Missoula, our homeless shelter. We found out when we did this as a group activity, built these transitions, that half of them, when they go home at night, have the windows in their rigs down and their sunroofs up, even in winter, because they like that feeling of the rush of the air that kind of fills the cavity of the car. And as they're tracking what's left in them, and help bring that energy out of their system. And then fire-based people are even more unique. They need heat to actually get their bodies moving, to actually release the energy. So a lot of people use hot water or sauna. I got to work with some surgeons at St. Pat's, and they don't have time to do anything but work out on the treadmill. They're interval trainers, so they get really, really hot in their workout. So we use the workout as the transition, and we had them think of themselves as like a smokestack on top of the treadmill. And as they're engaging the memory of the things they're still carrying, they would just let the heat of the workout, let that burn out the top of their head. And then one of the physicians said, when we checked in a couple of weeks after we worked with them, she said, it's like I get to step off the treadmill into the endorphin rush of the fresh new day, right? So there's that shift that can occur. And then the last element that's effective is water. And, you know, water's been a purification element for centuries in various cultures. Like think about Christian baptism or the sacred rivers in Southeast Asia. And there's some things that just don't leave people's systems without the use of water. So what I wanted to do is I just wanted to describe for you a transition activity that I did for about a year when I was working on North Reserve Street in Missoula and living down in Lolo. And I want you to listen to which of the elements are present in my transition activity, because sometimes we blend elements together. So what I would do is I would go out to my car that was in front of my office. And before I get in the driver's side to drive home, I would track what was still left in my body from the day's work. And I started to think about it as toxic snowpack. Okay. Some days it was like heavy and wet. Other days it was brittle and sharp, like it would cut me. Other days it was diaphanous, kind of like everywhere. I couldn't get my head around it. But whatever the quality, I would lift it out of my body and I would just put it on the roof of my car. Then I get in the car, I drive out to North Reserve, head up over this overpass to Costco. We call it Costco Hill. And as I'm driving, I'm just visualizing the snow like flying off my car and crashing all over Reserve Street. Then I get to the other side of that hill, I dump a bunch more. I get down to the next big intersection, which is Mullen Road, where there's a Walmart. And as I'm waiting for this long light, I can feel the stuff kind of melting off the side of the vehicle. And it kind of pools under the rig. And then I would like splash with the green forward and let it go. And then there's a turn to 93 South, and I would take it super fast just to blow off the last little bit of material, and then drive like 75 up into my house. And we have a rule at my house now that I have to take a shower before I talk to my partner at the end of a therapy day. So what do you guys hear in that? Earth, air, fire, and water, or water? I'm curious. What do you hear?
I hear water
Yeah, where do you hear the water?
from the snow and your shower and the slush.
Got it. So like, it's interesting. There's all these elements of water. I used to think it was just the shower, but someone pointed out when you use metaphor, it starts with toxic water, and then the ritual is actually wiser than my rational mind when I started doing it. Any other elements you hear?
I heard a little air, sounded
Yeah.
like as the air, as the last bit of the material was blowing off of the car, and the diaphanous nature of it, it's dispelling. Sounded like a little bit of air in there.
You definitely, the blowing off of the air is definitely part of it. Any other elements you guys hear?
I hear earth as well, and I think about just the very distinct route and
You got it.
the sort of markers in your environment as you go.
That intersection to intersection thing is definitely an earth related element. I don't live in that direction anymore. I live up on the reservation in Moise, and at the top of Evero Hill, there's a animal bridge, which is a tunnel that you go through as if you're driving. And I've been doing that for like 15 years. If you look on the right side of that tunnel, if you had x-ray glasses, you would see tons of my secondary trauma on the Missoula side of that tunnel. Because my theory is Lake County has enough of its own trauma. It does not need my trauma to add to it. So I keep it on this side of the animal bridge. And then the other element of earth is the crashing onto Reserve Street, like giving it back to the earth. And like, I don't know what your guys' relationship with box store streets are, but to me, that's the best use of them, is just to hold my secondary trauma, and it's all kind of good. So it's like using these playful elements to try to create power is really what we're about with these transition activities. I know we need to close and wrap up here, but I did want to say one more thing about transitions. I was working with a team down in Stevensville of teachers, and one of the teachers said, you know, I don't have any time to do this stuff, Andy. I'm busy and I have a second job. And I was like, well, what's your job? And she says, well, I'm a small organic farmer. And I was like, okay. I'm like thinking earth. I'm like, what's your farm chores? And she says, well, I feed chickens because I have an egg business. So I said, show me the movement. And so she was showing me this chicken feeding movement. And I said, let's just think of it this way. When you're feeding the chickens at the end of the day, just give them the trauma that's been embedded in your body through the work at the school. So just like feed it to the chickens. So she looked at me in kind of like strange way. And then I saw her at a farmer's market like 6 weeks later. And she actually saw me before I saw her. And she was like waving and doing this, like all at the same time. And so I went up to her. I was like, what is going on? And she goes, Andy, she goes, it is working. She goes, I'm kinder to my kids. I feel fresher at the beginning of the day because I'm just offloading this material on a really regular basis. And so I was really jacked that it was working. And I was excited for her. But I do want to tell you guys that I did stop buying eggs from her because I did not want to get that trauma-fed chicken egg back into my life, like in any way. So that's my story with the chickens. So anyway, thank you guys for the chance to work with you. I know we filled the time and there's more stuff. I'm going to send some follow-up resources through Barb to get out to you guys. And I'm excited about Amy and Kelly's ongoing work in the community. So thanks so much for this chance, and hopefully we'll be able to meet together at some point in person and do more of this work. So thank you very much. Take good care, you guys.